The years 2015 to 2024 have been designated by the United Nations as the International Decade for People of African Descent. Around 200 million people in the Americas identify themselves as being of African descent. Many millions more live in other parts of the world outside of the African continent. People like Irvin Simmons in the United States, Sandra dos Santos in Brazil, and Imran in India are all descendants of African slaves. These descendants often constitute some of the poorest and most marginalized groups, with limited access to quality education, health services, housing, and social security. Men, women, and children were brought here from Africa to work on plantations, growing indigo, rice, and cotton, turning a profit for their masters. But all that changed in 1861, when the Civil War broke out, largely over slavery, pitting states in the South against those in the North. More than 1,000 freed slaves settled here on Dafusky Island, but only 13 descendants of slaves occupy the island today. They're struggling to uphold their rights to inherited land that is now prime real estate.
There must be a way that they could address people who have always had their land.
To help the descendants of slaves and those of African heritage, the United Nations created an International Decade for People of African Descent. Launched in January 2015, the decade runs through December 2024. The decade aims to celebrate the important contribution of people of African descent worldwide, advance social justice and inclusion policies, eradicate racism and intolerance, promote human rights, and assist in creating better, more prosperous communities in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, spearheaded by the United Nations.
This is the lobby that they have. Every year they have a theme, and this is the theme for this year, so you can see the screen. Alright. So the most important reason why we're here is that this evening they're having a cultural and culinary arts breakout session, and the diplomats will be there. Various organizations that are involved with the UN will be there, and the main purpose of having this is the International Decade for People of African Descent, and in conjunction with today, which is the Observe Day for the International Day for the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. So me and we speak to a lot of people who will be here who are involved with this program, because that's the discussion for today, and that's the reason why they're having that session in the lobby from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Like I said, this place should be packed out with people from our community. But as you can see, it's only Peace and Shalom families, DivineProspect, the Kingdom Harbinger Ministries, and we're here at the UN. We touched on this earlier, but this is the reason why we're here, family. So we can get it up top. Remember slavery. Say it loud. Now, I don't know how saying it loud is going to resolve anything, but it's a start. You're raising your voice up, bringing awareness. The next step is, how do you implement what is being discussed on the General Assembly floor, right? So I'm going to go over this with you guys real quick so you guys get an idea, overview of what this program is about, all right? So this exhibit marks the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, observed each year on March 21st. Keep that in mind, March 25th. So make sure you're here next year when this goes down. The observant offers an opportunity to remember those who suffered and died at the hands of the brutal slavery system, and to recognize the contributions that people of African descent have made around the world. To more permanently honor the victims of slavery, a memorial titled The Ark of Return was erected on the Visitors Plaza at the United Nations headquarters in New York in 2015. This permanent memorial invites people to contemplate the legacy of the slave trade and to fight against prejudice and racism today. The theme for 2018 commemoration is Remember Slavery, Triumphs and Struggles for freedom and equality. Now this already sounds like a setback, struggles for freedom and equality as opposed to advancement of freedom and equality. The theme celebrates the gains of people of African descent from slavery to present. It also acknowledges the challenges that have been overcome in the movement towards freedom and equality in all professions. The National Organization of Minority Architects, which we just met the sister earlier, champions diversity within the design community by helping architects of African descent to overcome bias and promoting their professional development. The Department of Public Information's Remember Slavery program, managed by the Education Outreach Section, was established by General Assembly Resolution 62 in 2007 to build upon what? UNESCO's Slave Route Project, and work with educational institutions and civil society to ensure that future generations learn the causes, consequences, lessons, and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as communicate the danger of racism and prejudice. The program raises awareness of the arc of return, produces educational tools on the transatlantic slave trade throughout the year, and organizes remembrance activities working closely with the global network of United Nations Information Centers, right? And again, this is from the Department of Public Information. Now, as the UN General Assembly commemorative meeting was going on, I was there, and I captured the US's portion, all right? Now, that was very, very key because I wanted to see, well, what feedback is the US giving in regards to these programs. Now, fortunately enough, they've admitted certain things, which is a start, but they didn't say anything about how they are implementing the program. And they've had several countries go up and demonstrate this, but the US had no way of letting the entire General Assembly and the visiting audience know how they're implementing these programs. This is like on a hush-hush, all right? But we're here to break ground and bring that intel back to you guys. So you guys can see this real quick. The transatlantic slave trade and architects of African descent. And this is what NOMA was about. This is what the design was about, right? The last things I want to read is, freedom of expression is a human right that all cultures should enjoy. We hope the work of these architects will encourage young people of African descent to realize their artistic dreams and goals. And I want to know, how are you guys helping to enable us to get to this point? All we want is the resources, and we can take it there for ourselves, family. So this is really what we're doing here today. So I'm glad you guys watched. Hope you enjoyed the footage that you guys see. Stay tuned for next year, but throughout the year, we're going to keep bringing awareness about these programs, putting pressure on the U.S. as a member state of this coalition to see what are they doing for our community so we can take back our reparations. And with that, thank you, family. Peace, shalom.
On behalf of Western European and other states, I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the host country, the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We gather today to commemorate a shameful and brutal period in the world's history. We remember the over 10 million men, women, and children who lost their lives and their dignity at the hands of the transatlantic slave trade. The rare messages of hope that come from this terrible time are the stories of the courageous men and women who fought for and won their God-given right to freedom. Some of them made the ultimate sacrifice, dying in slavery so that others may live in freedom. We can't change this painful part of our history, but we can learn from it by remembering these remarkable people. We remember Elizabeth Freeman, an African-American slave who was the first to sue for her freedom and win in Massachusetts court in 1780. She was inspired to fight for her freedom by listening to the wealthy family she served discuss the Bill of Rights. In describing her time in captivity, Elizabeth said, quote, "If 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that 1 minute, I would have taken it, just to stand 1 minute on God's earth as a free woman." 200 years later, Elizabeth's pain still stings for anyone who believes in the inalienable right to freedom. Elizabeth won her liberty, but most slaves had to wait 83 years for President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And even then, the journey to full participation in the American dream for African Americans was far from over. It was not until the 1960s, in the not too distant past, when the descendants of slaves were granted equality before the law. And that struggle continues. In Elizabeth's words and her example, we find the inspiration for all of us to protect the hard-won gains of liberty and to continue our work to extinguish hate and discrimination. Next week, we will commemorate the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. In 1963, when Dr. King was jailed in Birmingham, Alabama, he wrote about the struggle for civil rights that he was leading in my country. Even from his jail cell, he wrote, quote, "If the expressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands." He was right. As the former governor of South Carolina, the progress we have achieved since Dr. King wrote those words has been especially important to me. My state's troubled history with slavery and discrimination is well known, and its lessons live on. Anyone who knows the South Carolina of today knows how much progress has been made as we use these lessons to move forward as a people. So while we are proud of what we have achieved, we do not forget the long and challenging road that got us here. That is why the United States helped fund the permanent memorial in remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And that is why the International Decade for People of African Descent is so important. They remind us of the work we must do to defeat slavery and inequality and to eradicate discrimination in all forms. And they give us role models like Elizabeth Freeman to guide our efforts. Elizabeth Freeman died a free woman in 1829. I'm told her tombstone still exists in an old cemetery in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It reads in part, "She was born a slave and remained a slave for nearly 30 years. She could neither read nor write, yet in her own sphere, she had no superior or equal. May we go forward to build a freer and more inclusive world, informed by the lessons of history and inspired by the example of extraordinary people like Elizabeth Freeman." Thank you.
I read the distinguished daughters of the United States statement. And now, I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. Vice President, first and foremost, I wish to commend the President of the General Assembly and the Secretariat for convening this important event in observance of International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. My delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by the permanent representative of the Gambia on behalf of the African Group. We wish to deliver these remarks in our national capacity. We thank the Honorable Graciela Dixon, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Panama, for her inspiring statement. The theme for this year's commemoration, Triumphs and Struggles for Freedom and Equality, suggests that our observance of the day must go beyond mere remembrance of the victims to foster dialogue on addressing contemporary forms of slavery and to renew our commitment to action. the dehumanizing slave trade, spanning nearly 400 years, resulted in the forced displacement of close to 12.5 million Africans from the continent, across the Atlantic, to the Americas and the Caribbean. While this heinous crime against humanity wreaked devastating consequences for the continent of Africa, we also acknowledge the fact that the victims of slavery and their descendants, through their stories of resilience and survival, inspired movements for change around the world, especially for Africa's decolonization and the Pan-Africanist movement. The influence and immense contribution of slaves and their descendants in the development of the Americas and the Caribbean must be acknowledged and celebrated. The slave trade, in spite of its horrendous nature, resulted in the transformation of the world through the shaping of new cultures. Research has shown that the transfer of technical and scientific knowledge and skills that went with it, together with the African spirituality and cultures, have all impacted positively on modern-day societies across the globe. The irrepressible spirit that led to slave rebellions on the islands of Haiti and Jamaica and many others ultimately inspired the movement to abolish slavery and fueled decolonization in Africa. The influence of renowned Pan-Africanists such as Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, among others, contributed to Africa's struggle for freedom, equality, and justice. Mr. Vice President, the remnants of the slave trade in Ghana are still visible today in the 40 or so slave forts and castles dotted along Ghana's coastlines, 3 of which have been designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The Ark of Return, located at the Visitors Plaza of the United Nations here in New York, is a permanent memorial to the victims of the slave trade and will for years to come remind us of this dark period in history. But more importantly, the Ark also carries a message of hope. When juxtaposed with the door of no return, which is located at the Elmina Castle in Ghana, from where thousands of slaves were shipped. Through special events and initiatives such as the Pan-African Historical Theatre Festival, popularly called PANAFest, held annually since the mid-1980s, Ghana has sought ways to bring Africans on the continent and in the diaspora together around the issues raised by slavery, which remain suppressed. Mr. Vice President, faced with the daily reminders of the persistence of contemporary forms of slavery, we must commit to meaningful dialogue on this subject. We are of the view that while greater commitment to existing international conventions will be crucial, our collective efforts to promote the respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and dignity of all persons, regardless of their race, color, gender, and religion, will be enhanced through continuing dialogue and better appreciation of cultural similarities as well as differences. More than 40 million people around the world in virtually every country remain trapped in modern-day slavery in the form of forced labor, forced prostitution, human trafficking, child labor, and forced marriages, with women accounting for 71%. Failings in the migration system, particularly in fragile states and regions in conflict and crisis, have given rise to horrible stories of slavery-like practices, and this must be urgently addressed. Member states must commit to upholding the human dignity of all peoples and stamping out prejudice, racism, and xenophobia in all its forms and manifestations. This is the only way we can ensure that never again will the world be confronted with the atrocity of the slave trade. Thank you.
Thank you.